Hi, I'm recording this video in case anybody is sick and can't come in. Today we're going to go over codes and contracts and how that relates to social contract theory, and we're going to spend some time discussing the principle of double effect. The exam is due this week. I sent out an email earlier this month highlighting that. I will follow up when I send this video out with a clarification on the due dates and things like that. I do want to spend a minute talking to the class about the job market. So job market's not great, but one piece of advice that I do tend to give, and it tends to be true whether the job market's good or bad, is if you do not have a job offer in hand, meaning you have already signed the paperwork, they already asked for things like your bank account information and stuff like that, by March, you should plan to at least take graduate classes as a non-matriculated graduate student for the fall. The reason for this is it looks bad on a resume to say you're doing nothing. Now, the truth is, you could be applying to 100 jobs a day, making it a full-time gig, just applying to work, prepping for interviews, writing cover letters, finding places that hire. That doesn't matter. What people want to see is you are working towards bettering yourself. So that either means having a job or sharpening your skills. Taking classes as a non-matriculated student is non-committal, meaning it's really easy to walk away. You can take classes that you like, especially as a graduate student. But if you don't have a job offer, this is my strong recommendation now to plan to take graduate classes in the fall. All right. Engineers, in the fulfillment of their professional duties, shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. All right, so we're going to discuss the principle of double effect now. So the principle of double effect is useful for a couple reasons. So you're going to run into situations where morals and ethics conflict in the sense that from a utilitarian standpoint, whether you're rule-based or not, it does conflict with Kantian ethics. Or whatever other ethical system you use. There's going to be conflicts, and you have to decide how to move forward. This is one of the tools. This is not an always use this scenario. This is sometimes this is applicable. So I want you to think about, and if you're not in class today, I want you to think about why you might be, sorry. Do you think this principle is practical in engineering decisions? Why or why not? And have you ever had to make a decision like this? So the rule of double effect applies if and only if an act with a good and bad consequence is justified, if and only if the act itself is either morally good or indifferent. The good effect is intended. So you mean for something good to happen by your action, by your decision. However, the bad effect must not be intended. So you can't intentionally do something bad to make something good happen. The bad effect may be foreseeable. In those instances, if you know that the bad effect might happen, you have to take every reasonable measure to minimize it. The bad effect is not used to bring about the good effect. The good effect is proportionally better than the bad effect.
Imagine you're watching a runaway trolley barreling down the tracks, straight towards 5 workers who can't escape. You happen to be standing next to a switch that will divert the trolley onto a second track. Here's the problem. That track has a worker on it too, but just one. What do? Do you sacrifice one person to save 5? This is the trolley problem, a version of an ethical dilemma that philosopher Philippa Foot devised in 1967. It's popular because it forces us to think about how to choose when there are no good choices. Do we pick the action with the best outcome, or stick to a moral code that prohibits causing someone's death? In one survey, about 90% of respondents said that it's okay to flip the switch, letting one worker die to save 5. And other studies, including a virtual reality simulation of the dilemma, have found similar results. These judgments are consistent with the philosophical principle of utilitarianism, which argues that the morally correct decision is the one that maximizes well-being for the greatest number of people. The 5 lives outweigh 1, even if achieving that outcome requires condemning someone to death. But people don't always take the utilitarian view, which we can see by changing the trolley problem a bit. This time, you're standing on a bridge over the track as the runaway trolley approaches. Now there's no second track, but there is a very large man on the bridge next to you. If you push him over, his body will stop the trolley, saving the 5 workers, but he'll die. To utilitarians, the decision is exactly the same. Lose 1 life to save 5. But in this case, only about 10% of people say that it's okay to throw the man onto the tracks. Our instincts tell us that deliberately causing someone's death is different than allowing them to die as collateral damage. It just feels wrong, for reasons that are hard to explain. This intersection between ethics and psychology is what's so interesting about the trolley problem. The dilemma and its many variations reveal that what we think is right or wrong depends on factors other than a logical weighing of the pros and cons. For example, men are more likely than women to say it's okay to push the man over the bridge. So are people who watch a comedy clip before doing the thought experiment. And in one virtual reality study, people were more willing to sacrifice men than women. Researchers have studied the brain activity of people thinking through the classic and bridge versions. Both scenarios activate areas of the brain involved in conscious decision-making and emotional responses. But in the bridge version, the emotional response is much stronger. So is activity in an area of the brain associated with processing internal conflict. Why the difference? One explanation is that pushing someone to their death feels more personal, activating an emotional aversion to killing another person. But we feel conflicted because we know it's still the logical choice. Trolleyology has been criticized by some philosophers and psychologists. They argue that it doesn't reveal anything because its premise is so unrealistic that study participants don't take it seriously. But new technology is making this kind of ethical analysis more important than ever. For example, driverless cars may have to handle choices like causing a small accident to prevent a larger one. Meanwhile, governments are researching autonomous military drones that could wind up making decisions of whether they'll risk civilian casualties to attack a high-value target. If we want these actions to be ethical, we have to decide, in advance, how to value human life and judge the greater good. So researchers who study autonomous systems are collaborating with philosophers to address the complex problem of programming ethics into machines. which goes to show that even hypothetical dilemmas can wind up on a collision course with the real world.
All right, so there are instances where the application of double effect can and can't be used. We're going to go over a few of them. And I want to point out, a lot of this is to emphasize instances where you would use the principle of double effect. Not that I think you should believe what I'm, I don't think you should have the same viewpoint as me. The emphasis here is just for demonstration to get a point across. So one example is the use of terror bombing versus tactical bombing. So the terror bomber aims to bring about civilian deaths in order to weaken the resolve of enemies. When his bomb kills civilians, this is a consequence that he intended, whereas the tactical bomber aims at military targets, not really planning on killing civilians, but when his bombs do kill civilians, this is a unintended consequence of his action. Even if it is equally certain that the two bombs will cause the same number of civilian deaths, the terror bomber tends to be considered impermissible while the tactical bombing is permissible. Similarly, euthanasia versus a medical accident. So if a doctor intends to hasten the death of a terminally ill patient by injecting a large dose of morphine, this act would be impermissible because he intends to bring about the patient's death. However, a doctor who intends to relieve a patient's pain with the same dose and merely foresaw the hastening of the patient's death would act permissibly. A doctor who believed abortion was wrong, even in order to save the mother's life, might nevertheless consistently believe that it would be permissible to perform a hysterectomy on a pregnant woman with cancer. In carrying out the hysterectomy, the doctor would aim to save the woman's life while merely foreseeing the death of the fetus. To kill a person whom you know to be plotting to kill you would be impermissible because it would be a case of intentional killing. However, to strike in self-defense against an aggressor is permissible, even if one foresees that the blow by which one is defending ultimately leads to death. Then there's the trolley thought experiment. I just showed you that video. And then the last is self-sacrifice versus suicide. So in that case, running into a building with the intent to save somebody, you're aware that there's a risk that you'll die running in, but that's a risk you're accepting, but that's really not why you're running into the building. Or say a bomb's going to go off and you want to cover it to prevent people from dying. Your real intent is trying to save the other people from dying. You dying by accident or dying afterwards is just a consequence, whereas the choice to kill oneself, the actual act of suicide, that's impermissible because you meant to do that. All right, so one of the objections to the principle of double effect is it's subjective, right? If you're at home, I want you to think about and respond to, why must the bad effect not be intended, even if it is foreseen? How do we decide whether the good effect outweighs the bad? And what steps would engineers take to minimize foreseeable harm? Now, another sort of objections is people frequently use it to justify wicked acts, because how we measure good and bad is subjective, right? And whether something is foreseen versus intended can, those lines can become very blurry. From an application standpoint, sometimes it just doesn't apply. It doesn't make sense to use it. And so when you do use it, you want to use it with care, and you want to make sure that what you're doing is defensible. All right, so this is a content advisory warning. So the next slide, we're going to talk about an abortion or the act of abortion. I am not endorsing either stance. I'm just using it as a tool to explain the concept and how to apply the principle of double effect. If you think this discussion is not for you and you don't want to talk about it, by all means, step out of the room, skip this section of the video. It's totally fine. If you're in class, I'll come get you. But the idea here is the woman who's giving the presentation, she is very pro-choice, but she is trying to explain to a group of adults why 0 abortions isn't a viable path.
Two principles that assist us in discovering the goodness or badness of human actions. The first of these principles is the principle of double effect. In cases in which we foresee the possibility or the inevitability of both a good and a bad consequence of a given action, the principle of double effect assists us in determining whether or not one's action is morally justifiable. The principle of double effect involves 5 criteria. The first criteria is that there is no easy alternative in a true dilemma. First, appealing to the principle of double effect is justified only if there is no alternative to the action at issue. This principle can be applied only in a genuine dilemma. The second criteria is that we have to choose the good. The action at issue must be good in its object, or at least neutral. Here, one is considering the object of the action, the first of the 3 sources in determining a moral action. The third is that we cannot intend to do evil. The possible or inevitable evil consequence must not be intended. Here, one is considering the intention. The person in a moral dilemma would prefer that there be no risk of evil at all, but can do nothing about the fact that such a risk, or even worse, the inevitability of evil, does exist. The fourth criteria is that the good outcome cannot be a consequence of the evil outcome. We cannot choose evil so that good will result. We cannot choose robbing a bank in order to pursue the final goal of giving money to the poor. In other words, the end does not justify the means. Here, one is considering the circumstances of the action. The fifth criteria is proportionality. The good consequence must be proportionate to the evil consequence. Here, one is considering the relationship between the consequences themselves. Let's take a look at the 5 criteria in the principle of double effect in action. Take the case of an ectopic pregnancy. In this situation, a mother has ovulated and the egg has been fertilized, creating a new human life. However, the new embryo did not implant in the uterine lining as it is meant to. Rather, the embryo has implanted outside of the uterus in the fallopian tube. This causes a serious problem for both the life of the baby and the life of the mother. For the baby, this will tragically lead to death. Without the proper nutrients to sustain life, which are available within the uterus, the child cannot thrive. The fallopian tube is not designed to provide for the baby, and it is also not large enough to contain the developing child's body. This leads to the mortal danger for the mother. Should the child continue to grow in the fallopian tube, it will eventually burst. This will cause a serious hemorrhage for the mother that is often life-threatening. Let's consider criteria 1, a true dilemma. Is this a true dilemma? The answer is, of course, yes. The second criteria, choosing the good. The object is to save as many lives as possible. In this case, sadly, the child's life cannot be saved. However, the mother's life may be saved. We are choosing to save the mother's life. In doing so, we are sadly accepting, not choosing, but tolerating the death of the human embryo. Remember that I said this was a dilemma. The third criteria is refusing to do the evil. This requires us to consider how the mother's life is to be saved in such an instance. We will give one example that does not fulfill that requirement and one example that does. One method of saving the mother's life in such a case is a saline injection. This would be injected into the fallopian tube, into the growing embryo itself, and would cause the embryo to die and dissolve. This would spare the mother's life and protect her fallopian tube from bursting. You will hopefully notice that in this case there is an evil outcome that is directly caused. While one may argue that the intention is still to save the mother's life, which is a good intention, this is still the direct killing of the child. The alternative option is to remove part of the fallopian tube itself. In this instance, once again, the mother's life is spared. Also in this instance, the child dies. However, this is considered a natural death for the child, as the death was not brought about on purpose but by the unfortunate natural circumstances of implanting in the fallopian tube. The doctor does not remove the child from necessary nutrients or an environment where the child can thrive, because those things have already been denied the child who is not developing in the uterus. The doctor does remove the possibility of a serious hemorrhage from the mother by removing the section of the fallopian tube. The fourth criteria, the good outcome must not be a consequence of the evil outcome. In this case, the evil consequence that is not intended is the death of the child. Did we kill the baby to save the mother? In the second instance, the child's death is a tragic, natural consequence of the mother's life being saved, but is not the direct means of saving that life. The fifth criteria, proportionality. The fifth criteria would ask whether the removal of the fallopian tube is justified for the saving of the life of the mother. The answer to that question is yes. While the surgery may lead to the mother being less fertile in the future, it should not render her infertile. Even in the case of infertility, the value of the mother's life is greater than her fertility. There are a number of caveats to this situation, as is to be expected with nearly all moral dilemmas. Every ectopic pregnancy is different. Some do not occur in the fallopian tube, but rather in the cervix or another location outside of the uterus. Two principles.
All right. So before I go further, I just quickly want to go over. Um, I do want to acknowledge this is an engineering ethics class. Um, I do my best to only give you or try to stick to engineering applications. Um, that can be kind of hard because in a professional environment, you're supposed to kind of avoid um, ethical situations. And so when I can't find good engineering scenarios or applications that demonstrate what we're trying to talk about, I'll default to certain science-based ones. And so that's why we just discussed the medical scenario. Um, Again, the emphasis of that video was to show the use of the principle of double effect, um, not an endorsement of her opinion. So now we're going to talk about social contract theory. So I want you to think about the state of nature. This was a theoretical construct used to imagine what life might have been like before society were formed. It is not a historical reality, but a thought experiment. Depending on who you ask, there are different views of how the world would naturally or does naturally evolve. One thought is life before organized society. So in this state, individuals are presumed to live without structure or government or any recognized authority. It represents a time when no formal laws, moral codes, or social structures govern human behavior. Some people view this as almost a state of anarchy. People live solitary, nasty, brutish, short lives because they're always in a state of not knowing what's going to happen next. They can't plan ahead. And they fear they're constantly in danger, and in that state, if everyone behaves that way, ultimately the end goal is, yourself, the things you need. Sometimes collectively you might grow into clans, but still the clan's thought process, or the tribe's thought process is still, what do we need? We only care about us. Other people had more optimistic views, where it was free and equal, and that they formed societies to ensure that protection of their natural rights, so life, liberty, since it's John Locke, it was property, not the pursuit of happiness. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that the state of nature was peaceful and that humans were naturally good, but societal development, especially the creation of private property, led to inequality and conflict. So if you're at home watching this video, I want you to think about which point of view you think, which philosopher's view of the state of nature seems most accurate to you. All right, so I'm going to talk about something I actually had to deal with. So I'm sure you all remember the pandemic, COVID-19, but I want to talk about a scenario I ran into that I never thought I would ever see in my life. I went to the grocery store every Monday with my son, and my routine every Monday was to go shopping for the week, and I'd systematically pick, 5 servings of vegetables, 5 servings of fruit, 5 servings of meat, 5 servings of grain, but I couldn't do that on this particular day. The produce section was empty. The meat aisle was empty. The butcher station was closed because they had run out of meat. The seafood section, gone. Everything was gone. I went to the dried goods section. Nothing. no canned tuna, no canned chicken, canned beans were gone. So now I'm like nervous. Like, I have some food at home, but I don't know what to do. And so my first thought is, well, I know some cans of tomato sauce have meat in them. So I went to that section. And as I'm going, my son, who he wasn't very old at the time, he was about 3, was like, he was giving me this look, like he knew something was up, and he knew that I was nervous. And I was doing my best to reassure him that everything was fine, without showing him that I was scared. And I remember at the time having the actual thought of stealing other people's carts, stealing their things, because I wasn't quite panicking yet. But the only thing that really stopped me wasn't, you know, that I was going to stand the moral high ground. It was more of the fear of being caught. Now, when I'm out with my son on a typical day, if I'm at Stop and Shop, there's a pretty high level of civility with kids, where people will give us extra space, and they'll give my son and now my daughter extra bandwidth in terms of how they behave, and they give us, literally when we're walking down the aisles, they'll actually try to make themselves smaller so we can go through because it's a big group. But that wasn't happening this day. Now, one thing I will say is when my son was in the cart on a normal day, nobody would ever touch the cart. Now, part of that was nobody would confuse that cart with theirs, because you don't accidentally grab a small child and say, oh, whoops, wrong cart. That doesn't happen. And usually people wouldn't move the cart. Nowadays when my cart is not full of people, people might move my cart out of the way to go get something on the other side of my cart, but they won't touch it if there's a child in it. So, because the aisle was packed, this is also the busiest time I've ever been in a store, is this particular day. I had to park the cart halfway down the aisle of where I actually needed to be. So that's where I put my son. I said, I'm going to be right back. And I walked to the other side to go get what I was grabbing. And as I'm squatting, as I'm grabbing this, that, and the other thing, I can hear a commotion, and I look over. And I see somebody trying to move my cart. So I stand up, because this is totally foreign to me. No one's ever done this, even when things were normal. And this guy is freaking out because he wants to go get something that's on the other side of the cart. And so I stand up and I start walking towards the cart. Now, my thought process was just, I'm just going to walk over, I'm going to move the cart for the guy. So I say, excuse me, I'm coming over. And at this point, this gentleman, instead of talking to me, I don't actually know what he heard, but he starts threatening me and my son, and basically telling me to get the fuck out of the way. And again, this is probably the one and only time I've dealt with something like this at a grocery store. But then it became clear that both my son and I were in physical danger because this person was having a meltdown. Now, luckily, the other people in the store, including the manager, descended on us and more or less told this gentleman he needed to stop and get out of the store before something bad happened. But in that moment, me as an adult, as a dad, I have never seen a scenario like this before, and I haven't seen it since. And the honest reason for this was because people were panicking. They were scared. They didn't know if their next meal was coming. Now, people with cooler heads knew that everything was going to be fine. The store, yes, was empty today, but it was going to be restocked tomorrow. But when people panic, when people get scared, they start leaning into their primal fears and they start throwing away social norms. And there is one social norm that people kind of expect, especially around kids, is to play softer, be nicer, use better language. The exact opposite happened in this scenario. This man was terrified, and he effectively decided to take it out on a child. So there is a level of expectation from society imposed on you, and those come in the form of social contracts. Sometimes you would know them as social norms. Very rarely are they actually written down, but let's spend a minute talking about what a contract actually is. So a contract is an agreement between two parties. Sometimes they're implicit, meaning they're unspoken. So this would be like a social contract, a social norm, or they're explicit, they're written down, meaning you know exactly what the contract says. And that agreement governs the behavior between the two groups. If you're at home, I want you to think about how this scenario that I just told portrays Hobbes' view. And I want you to think about what role cooperation plays in avoiding chaos. Now, generally speaking, people like social contracts, they like agreements, they like knowing what's going to happen next. It gives a lot of people a lot of anxiety when they don't know what's happening next. So by having these agreements, by having social norms, by having contracts, you have a mutual agreement that establishes rules, laws, and in certain instances, institutions. By removing that stress and anxiety, because you know what's going to happen, you're more willing to give people around you a break. And that frequently comes in the form of some kind of cooperation. It avoids conflicts really well. It resolves conflicts peacefully. And it makes things just all around easier. And so there is a big emphasis on trying to make sure contracts exist and everybody knows them. So there's explicit contracts. These are formal. They tend to be based on verifiable information and thus can be enforced by a court. There's implicit or informal contracts. These tend to be non-verifiable. Therefore, they cannot be enforced by a court and must be self-enforcing. This is a social thing. All right, so engineers and social contract theory. Why do we care? So when you want to do, say, infrastructure development, and you want to go build a major bridge or a highway, there's this thing called eminent domain, where from time to time, if you build something and you need typically land to do it, you can kind of just take it. There's rules to it. We're not really going to go into it. But when you're designing roads and you're designing bridges and things like that and other infrastructure, even though you have that tool, you can use eminent domain if you want to. From a social standpoint, it tends to be frowned upon. And so there is an expectation on you to consider, if I build this, will people like it? Even if, ultimately it leads to more happiness and less sadness for everybody, if the manner in which you go and build it socially might cause a lot of backlash. Engineers work with governments and communities to design infrastructure all of the time. And a lot of friction between engineers and other groups happen at this step. And so you want to design infrastructure that balances public needs with the environment and safety concerns, but you also must consider the impact of their work on communities aligning with social contracts, emphasis on mutual benefit and responsibility. So another case would be the environment. So if you wanted to implement sustainable energy solutions like wind farms or solar panels, the engineers must address environmental challenges while considering public welfare and future generations. Their work in creating sustainable solutions reflects a commitment to social contract principles of stewardship for the environment and society. If you're at home, I want you to look at or think about lines 3, 4, 5, and 6, and think of instances where industry and engineers have had to apply social contract theory with what they were doing, and explain why, what was the motivator, what made the engineers do the project in the first place, and then explain to me how social contract applied to them. Okay? So there's this idea of being consent to governed, or giving consent of being governed. So as an engineer, you can relate to the idea of being governed in a broader sense. While you might not have a direct say in the formation of a government, you do operate within the bounds of certain governing principles, such as the laws of physics. These laws are universal and immutable, and as an engineer, you've essentially agreed to work within these constraints whether you like it or not. Furthermore, your expertise in physics means that when you engage in activities like approving, designing, or building, you ensure that the resulting products or systems adhere to the laws of physics. This alignment with scientific principles ensures that your creations won't break any natural laws. In your professional journey, you may also choose to join societies or organizations like ASME, ISO, ISPE, API. These societies have established documented rules and standards that you're expected to follow. Your decision to adhere to these rules is akin to a form of consent. By joining these societies, you acknowledge and agree to abide by the established standards and regulations, contributing to the overall governance of your profession, ensuring that your work meets recognized industry standards. In essence, the idea of consent of the governed extends beyond politics and into various aspects of our lives, including our professional responsibilities as engineers. It underscores the importance of accepting and adhering to governing principles and rules, whether they be the laws of physics or the standards set by professional organizations to ensure smooth functioning and ethical conduct within our respective domain. All right, contracts. So we have the explicit contracts, we have the original contracts, and then we have the unwritten contracts. Today we're exploring different types of social contracts, explicit, original, unwritten, and how we apply not only in society, but also in engineering fields. These contracts form the foundation of many of our legal and societal interactions. Let's break them down. All right, an explicit contract are agreements that are clearly stated and signed, laying out specific terms and conditions. For example, immigrants sign agreements to follow the country's laws. In engineering, these contracts are like regulatory standards, ISO, API, OSHA, that we are required to follow. If it's documented, compliance is mandatory. There's original social contracts. These are kind of like laws. They govern our behavior without us having to explicitly agree. So natural-born citizens don't sign a contract to follow laws, yet they are expected to. In engineering, this applies to natural laws like gravity and thermodynamics. These are constant that we must respect, even though one formally agrees, though no one formally agrees to them. And then there's unwritten social contracts. Those we adhere to without formal agreement, like societal norms. Think of how we naturally queue in line. In engineering, this is similar to industry standards. While not written down or required by law, these practices are commonly followed and expected. Unwritten contracts in engineering. So industry standards are a great example of unwritten contracts. For instance, companies fly you out for an interview is a common practice, but it's not a legal requirement. However, if a company deviates from this standard, they need a valid reason. Similarly, in engineering, if you don't follow certain industry standards, people will notice and expect an explanation. So just like in life, engineering involves explicit, original, and unwritten contracts. It's crucial to understand these different types and recognize how they shape both legal obligations and everyday professional behavior. Now, there are issues with contracts. Now, there's one argument, and this is more about laws. Should you still follow a law you don't agree with? I'm not going to tell you not to break the law. Probably would get in trouble if I did that. But how many of you sped to class today? Have you broken any laws this week? Probably did. And you probably made the decision to not follow it. You probably had reasons to not follow it. But the laws exist for a reason. And generally speaking, a lot of the times the reason those laws exist is because by everybody following the law or following the intent of the law, you make everything better for everybody else. And so you want the people around you to follow the law because that makes things better for you, but they're not going to follow the law if you also don't follow the law. Effectively, that's the argument for whatever the social or situational contract is for why you should be following it. Now, I'm going to quickly, this is kind of a side discussion, but this does come back to laws. Back when I was a student at URI, my mother was still working as a 911 operator, and every year, without fail, her shift would include calls from one particular stretch of road near campus on Stony Fort Road. Now, Stony Fort Road had a reputation. On the very day the leaves came down in the fall, or in the first night the temperature dropped below freezing, the calls would start. Every year, someone in a shiny four-wheel drive truck or SUV would head down the road, confident that their vehicle could handle whatever nature threw at them. And every year the same thing happened. They hit a patch of wet leaves or invisible black ice, lost control, and slid straight into the stone walls that give Stony Fort its name. Most of the time, the drivers weren't local. They'd say, "Oh, I'm from New York." But when asked where in New York, they'd answer things like Trenton, Newark, New Jersey City, North Hudson Sewerage Authority, or Atlantic City, which, of course, is in New Jersey. So not only were they overconfident, they didn't even know where they were from. The irony is that the road was well marked and well maintained. The signs were there, slippery when wet, bridge freezes before road, speed limit clearly posted, but drivers ignored them. They assumed that doesn't apply to me. I know better. My car can handle it. And this ties directly into the ideas of original contract or laws. These contracts create the framework for how we coexist. They're there for everyone's safety, whether we signed anything or not. Natural-born citizens don't get to opt out. They're expected to follow the rules. But just like those drivers on Stony Fort Road, people often think the rules are there for other people. They overestimate their ability, or they convince themselves that they're the exception. And when they ignore the contract, or in this case, the posted laws of the road, it doesn't end well. The laws of physics, like the laws of society, don't bend just because someone believes they're above them. All right, so now we're going to talk about the prisoner's dilemma. If you are at home, I want you to basically look up what the prisoner's dilemma is and how you think you would play it. Keep in mind, you don't know what the other prisoner is going to do. You can only say what you would do. So there's a many variants of this. The first one is they are complete strangers. So the example people like to use is you're a student and you saw a protest and the protest turned violent and you ran away. But as you were running away, you got arrested. Then the police officers, because they're immoral, randomly arrested somebody off of the street and said that they were also at the protest. And then they say to you, you have two options. You confess and tell us that you were part of the violent protest, even though you saw it, but you weren't part of it, or you remain silent. Those are your two options. Now, the random person they've arrested off the street who had no involvement is given the same set of options. Confess that they were part of the violent interaction, or remain silent. Now, if you confess and they confess, you both go to jail for 5 years. If you confess and they remain silent, you get out free, but they go to jail for 10 years. If you remain silent and they confess, you go to jail for 10 years and they get out free. If you both remain silent, you both get out in 2 years. What do? Now, in class, I would ask around, but the truth is they have found that in the first scenario, if there's no communication, you two don't know each other in any way, you don't know the other guy doesn't know you are both confessing. There's a very high chance you both will confess. However, if you partner, meaning you have talked to each other ahead of time, you both understand the rules of the game, being that the optimum point here is you both remain silent, there's a much better chance of both of you remaining silent. But I need to be clear here, it's not 100%. Before, it was 95% both confess, and then next to 0 being you both remain silent. Now it's about a quarter in all 4 boxes. And with that information, do you still remain silent? Another way to think about this is how should you behave in society and how should society behave around you? Unfortunately, the reality is you're best off if you're selfish and everyone else is altruistic. But people have observed that if you are super selfish and the people around you initially are altruistic, they tend to shift. And that is an unstable scenario to be in. The second best is if everyone is altruistic. This is technically a stable place to be in. It's harder to get there and it takes more maintenance to stay there. The third best off is if everyone is selfish. This is another stable point and it's easier to attain. The last is and this is the worst scenario, is you're altruistic and everybody else is selfish. This is an unstable place to be. The vast majority of the time, if you are in this scenario, you will eventually break and just become selfish yourself. It's not to say, you can't, it is possible for you to start in the first scenario where you're selfish and everybody else is altruistic, and then transition to everyone being altruistic. That is possible. It's hard, but it is possible. Same with you being altruistic and everyone else being selfish. You could make everybody else also altruistic, but again, it's hard. So with that in mind, you want to think about how you should behave around other people and how people will behave around you. And with that, how you should plan. In a professional setting, when you're interviewing or before you enter any contract, I want you to think about what you should expect from the people you're working with, working for. And you are well within your rights to ask things like, what are we expecting of each other so we both benefit from the relationship? Asking why the relationship is beneficial for everyone involved. Determining what's going to happen if one of the parties isn't happy. Make it clear what your limits are. Now, maybe I'm being pessimistic, but my default is, for the most part, people are either a mixture of just selfish or low levels of thought. Because if, a lot of bad things happen because people don't really think about what they're doing. And you are expected to ask, or it's well within your rights to ask these questions during an interview or before you get hired. And there's a reason to ask for this stuff. When people get scared, when deadlines becomes stressful, people start deviating from what's reasonable. So what's reasonable for the most part is 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day at your job. However, if a deadline's coming up and your boss is getting stressed and all that jazz, suddenly they might expect you to work more hours. Well, there are scenarios where that's appropriate, and there's scenarios where that's not appropriate. And so when you go work those extra hours, you need to know that you're going to be treated fairly about it. You're going to be compensated. And if your boss is doing the right thing, following a contract, being altruistic, they're going to give you some kind of benefit, either time off later or more pay or more visibility or whatever it is. But if it becomes clear that's not going to happen, that means they're breaking their end of the contract, whether it's literally written or it's social. And at that point, that's when you need to start thinking about defection. Another way to think about it is if you're working with a coworker and you agree to split the task. Each person completes their portion of the assignment by the deadline. But your coworker repeatedly misses deadlines and you end up having to scramble to get their half. You can't trust them. You have to treat them like a selfish prisoner, right? Another is if you have two small businesses that enter into a joint venture. One handles marketing and the other handles product distribution. The expectation is both contribute equally to growth and share profits. However, if one side withholds profits or doesn't deliver on logistics, the relationship becomes exploitive and it will dissolve. That's another instance where you should think about defection. Then there's friendships. You confide in a close friend, trusting them to keep your confidence. The expectation is the information you've handed to them, they don't share with everybody else. If they share that information without your consent, especially if it's repeated, you should start thinking about whether you should continue that relationship or not. I know on my end, I've had to, if I can't share certain information with people because I know they'll repeat it, and I realize that to talk to this person, I actually have to sanitize things. Well, that puts me in a spot where I don't want to think about stuff. And I don't want to think about that stuff when I'm stressed. So I just don't talk to that person anymore. It's too hard.